Hello and welcome back to the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. And this is the second show of the new year and the second show of our fourth season, which I cannot believe that, I was putting the first show of the new season in our little distribution portal. And, you have to mark the season, and I marked the season as the fourth. And I was like, how is that possible? How did we, it's pretty amazing. Because I think we started this podcast just kind of everybody has a podcast, let's do a podcast. And then we love it. And we love the feedback and we love doing these shows. And so it just kind of stuck. But it's pretty amazing that we're in our fourth year, right?
I know, that's crazy. Because when you first said, let's do a podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, really?
I know. Amy kind of went kicking and screaming. Let's full disclosure. Amy kind of went
absolutely
screaming into this podcast.
100%.
But it's really fun. And it gives also an opportunity because Amy is oftentimes the person behind the curtain. And it also gives her an opportunity to kind of showcase her knowledge and her talents, which is great. And, but one of the reasons that I also love doing these shows. So today we are talking about, book titles, how to avoid book title pitfalls. So choosing the best title, not necessarily as granular. We're not going to get, because that's a little hard to do, to get as granular, if you have a mystery book, this is what you should name your book. But in terms of what to watch out for with Amazon, things to avoid, things to look for, how to create descriptive subtitles. And yes, even if you have a fiction book, you can still do descriptive subtitles. And I think that it's also worth leading this show off with why, because I've alluded to it a bunch of times. We've talked about it a bunch of times in kind of roundabout ways, but How to Sell Books by the Truckload, which I renamed and is now up for pre-order under the Amazon formula. And this is the 10th, anniversary edition of the book. It's, we decided to rename it. Well, actually, Amy came to me one day and she will tell you what happened. And I, much like Amy with the podcast, I went into the renaming thing kicking and screaming. Amy, do you want to tell everybody why you did to rename the book? Sorry, I'm not laughing. I'm laughing.
Yeah. So again, 10 editions. I mean, that is a feat in itself, I think. There are very few books out there that have had 10 editions. I would think the percentage is pretty small.
Right.
Not having done this research before. So I'm pulling these quote unquote stats out of my, what, but still 10 editions is a big deal. That's a long time to stick with something. And I think the final breaking point, and this was not the first time this has happened, but the timing was fortuitous. I think in that Penny was getting, was in the throes of the most recent update. And then we also had an issue with somebody who had written us because of, this is wrong, I can't find this, I want to cash in my promo for Truckload, all this stuff. He was very upset. And honestly, I didn't know half of what he was talking about. And I really, when people write about stuff like that, I do take it very seriously. And I'm like,
she does.
Wow. I don't remember most of this. And basically we ended up finding out he essentially had purchased a very early edition of Truckload.
Yeah.
It was not the most recent one. So that's why I didn't recognize the promo. He was mentioning things that, that were referenced in the tips that he could no longer find on his page. And it was, I'm sure, a headache for him. I totally get it, but equally as a headache for me, because I'm sitting here assuming he had the most recent edition and thought I was losing my mind. And so this all kind of came to a head at once where it's I think we need to consider doing a rebrand of this. So this next one really just can stand on its own, and really clearly be the new, most updated version of what you have to say and share about what's going on with Amazon and how to succeed on that platform. Well, to really kind of set it apart. It was time.
Well, and and then we had to, of course, we had to come up with a name for the book, which we won't go down that difficult path because that was a challenge too. But I really went into this case. So when this guy wrote, and actually we had somebody who wrote, was it after that? I can't remember. And who was really mad because they'd also purchased, and by the way, the editions do say this is not the most current edition, but as we know as authors, sometimes readers don't read the descriptions very well or gloss over stuff or whatever. But and he was mad. Like he was like, oh, I'm just gonna blast this book on Amazon. And I told the guy, I'm like, listen, let me send you an updated edition. Please, you bought an old edition. Let me send you the updated. Your book is outdated. And then I never heard from him again. So the review never appeared. But I don't know what happened. But people
drunk online shopping rears its ugly head.
Right. But that was a real challenge with that book, even though I had blended. So the other piece of too is you may be listening to this thinking, well, can't you just ask Amazon to combine the editions so you just have one book online? Yes. But Amazon is also very finicky about that. So I had blended as many editions as I could. And then Amazon was just like, well, if you go over X amount of percentage, like it's 20%, but that's also kind of a moving target. Amazon says, well, this is a brand new book, so it's going to stay on there. So then I was kind of, not in a good place in terms of having these older titles up there. And, you can pull them, but that's also, I'm not a huge fan of that. I mean, unless a book is really, really, really bad, I'm not a huge fan of that. So here we are now with the Amazon formula, and it took a long time to rename the book. So it's a labor of love, as you know, if you've ever titled a book, right? And I think, Amy, we'll talk about some of the Amazon algorithm stuff, but my biggest pet peeve with book title, well, it's a little bit twofold. So book titles that are almost impossible to pronounce, and book titles that are extremely descriptive to a very narrow audience. Right. So if you, and I'm thinking about this psychiatrist book that we worked with a whole bunch of years ago. And I remember kind of going toe to toe with the publisher for this book. Like, you cannot give this book this name because nobody will buy this book. Well, but the people buying the book know what that means. I'm like, there's like 5 of those people out there. Like, you literally cannot name this book. To me, those are 2 of, difficult to pronounce. If it's difficult to pronounce, it's going to be hard for that person to share it with friends. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah. And I would say a lot of times something being difficult to pronounce is also difficult to spell. Like, not always, but they tend to go hand in hand. And I will say, Amazon is good at correcting some typos, but it can't correct super specific typos, and that's when you end up being shown a bunch of really random products that aren't even books, when you try to figure it out, like off the cuff, like, I think this is what it's called, that they're never going to find your book that way.
Yeah.
Amazon is not that advanced in that they can completely redirect an out of left field search and get them to your book page. So you have to be really careful about that kind of stuff. Right.
Also, think about the fact that the book title should not be embarrassing, right? It should not be embarrassing to say or to share. I mean, that's just my take. And by embarrassing, I don't necessarily mean, sexy or raunchy or anything like that. I mean, I'm just talking about like a book title, like How Not to Be a Shoplifter or something, right? You're not, I mean, I realize that we're talking more about online purchases, and I realize that, but bookstores and libraries, like, you're probably not going to go into a bookstore and go, hey, do you have that book on How Not to Be a Shoplifter? Do I have to pay for it? Sorry, there's a lot of jokes waiting to happen with that book title. But but that's kind of, I mean, that's the other piece of it too, is that you want your book title to be easy to remember, easy to pronounce, easy to spell, and easy to share.
Right. Exactly. And your book title is part of your brand as well. So I think that's something that doesn't, so you have to think long term also when you're coming up with the title, because you want to be able to ride that wave for a long time. So if you've got a clunky or hard to spell, or, as Penny said, embarrassing, or, something that's kind of like an inside joke, but it's not something that you get right away. You know what I mean? Like, you have to know more about the book to understand why the title is titled as it is. That's also a far reach. Not everybody, most people are not going to get that far to quote unquote get it. So you have to be careful with that kind of stuff too. But you want to be able to use your title in your marketing and your promotions and in your branding. Yeah. And so if it's clunky and too specific or very vague or hard to spell, just imagine how that's going to look on social media posts or promos that you're doing, or in ads that you're running on like BookBubs, or on Amazon, or even doing a Goodreads giveaway. The Goodreads giveaways, you have very few characters to work with. So your title really has to sell your book on its own with just a very little bit of support, and similar with Amazon ads, So you have to think about the long-term effects of how you're going to be able to use your title when you're finally deciding what to do with that and how you're going to structure it.
Right, exactly. And I think doing some, if you have the ability to, if you have a tribe, if you have some kind of a email list or a reader fan group or people on social media, ask them what they think of the title, because that's what I did with the Amazon formula, right? Mm-hmm. Is, test out the title. And if all else fails, you could always go into your local bookstore and talk to the people who were on the front lines of selling books.
Mm-hmm. And I think certainly it can morph into a very different discussion, I think, for fiction and nonfiction. Nonfiction, Penny, what we went through, I think, a lot back and forth and brainstorming and soundboarding with the new Amazon books title, is that really trying to pinpoint what the book was for and what it delivers on, because it's easy, especially for nonfiction. I think it can get tricky to come up with a title that really does represent exactly what the content of the book is, because you can have a lot of fun with wording and things like that, but it's actually easy to kind of get off the path, kind of off the mark on what you're actually delivering on too, when you start getting creative with the subtitle. Sometimes, you have to really dig in and say, like, okay, wait, does this subtitle really talk about what the primary goals for this book are? You know what I mean? And there's a lot of workshopping that has to be done to get that exactly right as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly true. I think the descriptive, one of the things that you don't want to do, even if your book is a mystery, is you don't want your title and your subtitle to be a mystery. Right. So I mean, huh? I know, I'm just full of one-liners today. Aren't I? I mean, but it is, and the other piece of it though too is that the book title research, and I don't want to get too far off of the main topic, but of course, with that preface, that I will. Book titles it's a really interesting study on book titles, like books that were retitled. Like Gone with the Wind was not originally Gone with the Wind. It was something like Tomorrow's Another Day or something like that. Which is kind of lame when you think of like Gone with the Wind, feels like such a stronger title. But understanding what what fits your market, and doing that kind of research, as I said, and even testing the title with your tribe or getting it out there is really going to save you a lot of money, because a title won't necessarily turn your book into a bestseller, but a bad title will, much like a bad book cover, will 10,000% prevent it from doing much of anything.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, if you go to the bestseller list for genre fiction, for example, you will see some very clear themes. You know what I mean? Like the books that are doing really well for suspense, those titles, they really do make sense, you know, and a lot of those books are really clever at using descriptive subtitles in very strategic yet subtle ways. Some of them are not so subtle. Those get a little crazy. But they are very, it fits what people are expecting. And we've talked about this before. It makes it so the shopper doesn't have to think too hard. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. You don't want a shopper to think too hard, to have to buy. So having a title that has the same vibe as your genre is really important. So if you look at suspense titles, that bestseller list for suspense titles versus even cozy mystery, you are going to see very different themes and vibes in how people are titling those books. It's certainly people that are hitting the bestseller list and doing all the right things, you know.
Yeah.
You can definitely tell that there's a difference. And when you see that right in front of you over and over again on multiple books, that's when it really, I think, can start to sink in. So if you're kind of going, what the hell are they talking about? Check out the bestseller list and you'll start to see those trends and those themes where titles don't have to be super long and descriptive, but they can still very much represent the genre that book landed in.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there are a number, as I alluded to, there are a number of books that were delivered to publishers that had one name and ended up being published under another name. But there are also a number of books that were originally published and did not do well, and then were renamed and essentially rebranded and did extremely well. And I want to say, and I hope I'm not lying, inadvertent, just accidental fibbing on the podcast. 10 Habits of Highly Successful People. I want to say that was one of them. It was
Really?
one of those success books that had not a really great title, and it just didn't do well. And the publisher pulled back and renamed, you know, because look, I mean, we understand that titling a book can be challenging. Even publishers fall into the trap of giving a book the wrong title, right? But I think it's very important to make your title as descriptive as possible. Obviously, you don't want to necessarily give away the entire book. So let me use an example of a fiction book that Amy and we were in this sort of informal book club that we read in October, which is kind of a spooky season. So it was a spooky title. And the book was called Hidden Pictures. And Hidden Pictures, for that book, was perfect because that's essentially what the book was about. So it was attention grabbing enough, right? Hidden pictures, like that sounds kind of, ooh, like what's that about, right? But it was also spot on to what the genre was. And so again, I get it. Titling a book can be challenging, but as Amy said, take a look at the bestseller list and just see what some of the other books in your genre, how they're named, and you know, take a look at their subtitles as well.
Yeah. And I will say, and granted, we can't make all of our decisions around the Amazon beast. I understand, like, there's a lot we can do strategically to make Amazon work for us, but at the same time, you know, they're constantly evolving. But I also wanted to share, Penny, that in some of my keyword research lately on Amazon, I'm noticing that Amazon is really leaning into showing titles that match searches. So the actual search terms you're using, Amazon is favoring showing books at the top of the page whose titles actually include those search terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this is where, again, going back to something really vague or generic or kind of an insiders only title that really means something to you, or even to the storyline. And as an author, you're going, no, like once they get to chapter 5, it's going to hit them and they're going to be, oh, that's why this, you know, that's why this title is titled that, or this book is titled that. Like, we get it. That's super exciting stuff. But just know that if you're making that decision, that could potentially be a longer road to getting in readers' hands simply because of how online retail works nowadays. So if you're going with something that's super unique to your storyline, your book, your inspiration, just know that it is going to be more complex to try to show up at the top of searches for your genre if your book title and included subtitle as well combined doesn't align with what makes sense for your genre or your topic.
Yeah. And to the point of the story that I told earlier, if you have released a book and you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, the title is problematic, because the other reason that titles can be problematic is that even if the cover is spot on, the title could potentially be misleading to the reader, not intentionally, and that's part of the reason why we struggled. By we, I mean, because Amy dug in and helped me with the renaming of the Amazon formula. That's part of the reason why renaming the Amazon book was so challenging, because you have to be careful. The title, even if it's fiction, is a promise to the reader. Right. And, if you are if your book is The Great Gatsby, your book had better have a Great Gatsby in it. Right. Mm-hmm. So, that's the other thing too, is keep in mind that your book title, whether fiction or nonfiction, is a promise to the reader. And I alluded to the fact that fiction authors can do subtitles. You can have a subtitle certainly on your book. Depending on, obviously depending on like a little what the book's about, but if your book does not have a subtitle, you can have a subtitle on Amazon, and just add it to the back end, or have the publisher add it to their upload when they add the book to Amazon. The more descriptive that you can get, the more that the reader is going to feel like, oh, this is the kind of book that I want.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
I think it's important to, again, I think that's a very good point, Penny. Like, you really have to, I think, definitely go through the process of like, I love this, I love that, this means a lot to me, this makes sense considering this like amazing moment in chapter 5, all those things. But then come at it in a second phase with your, long-term vision in mind too, because I think there's always ways to still get a version of what you want, but then also come up with a version that is going to serve you well on Amazon. Because, if the version that you love the most isn't going to make sense to shoppers, then you're really shooting yourself in the foot,
Yeah, because it really, at the end of the day, much like the book cover, the title really isn't about you, even though I realize that it is about you. And this is particularly true for memoir writers, right? So if you have a memoir, remember that the first 2 letters in memoir are me. So you want to make sure that your book is titled such that it has a wider appeal if you want it widely read. I mean, I know some people write a memoir and want to just have their family read it, which is great. I think one of the challenges that authors have who write, let's say, cookbooks, right? And we've worked with a number of cookbooks. So cookbooks, nutrition books, there's a lot of competition out there. If you're thinking of business books, anything like that has just a ton of other books on that it's sharing shelf space with, you're really going to want to hone in on what the biggest takeaway is of the book and try to incorporate that benefit into the book title, because your book title should be the benefit.
Right. That's a very good point. Your book title is right there with your cover. Your first chance is to sell that book.
Yeah. It's and keep in mind is that even if and we get so close to our books all the time, which again is why I was so firmly cemented in the fact that I wanted to keep Truckload up. Like, well, you can't change this. This is like a brand. I've had this brand for years. I've had this brand, and to Amy's point, it was really time to kind of move on and give the book its own sort of stage. And not just because of the people who were buying older books and didn't realize that they were buying older books and then emailing Amy and bitching.
Although that's a good way to do that.
Right. That's definitely a good way to do it. But titling a book, stay away from those title generators, please. Even like we were talking about this in the green room, ChatGPT has gotten to the point, like if I go on to ChatGPT and ask for, rewrite this book description or something, it'll also try to rename the book. So everybody apparently wants to get their hand in book titling, but do your research. Don't use a title generator. Do your research, test the market, go out to your audience, and make sure that you're putting it in front of people who are going to tell you, no, I think this is what I did with the Amazon formula. This is what I did with the covers that I had for it. The first cover that I had for the Amazon formula, legit, every person on social media shot it down. And I was thrilled. No, I was not thrilled because I was like, oh my God, get this cover done. But I was really thrilled to get that kind of honest feedback. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
For sure. So I think that, did we cover everything?
I think we did.
Okay. Just a reminder that the Amazon formula, which I know I've mentioned like 48 times in the show, the Amazon, I can hear our production crew in the background barking. That's awesome.
No, that's not mine.
Oh, sorry. That must be my production crew. The guy in charge of snacks.
It's like, who's really in charge here? Clearly not me. Like,
I know it. But I want to thank you so much for listening. I know I've mentioned the Amazon formula a bunch. The book is currently in pre-order. We are doing all sorts of fun swag-based giveaways for pre-ordering the book. So be sure to tune into our social channels and check those out. And thank you so much for listening. Once again, we always appreciate your show ideas, your feedback, and we would love a review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.